30 plays, Harold Pinter is widely regarded as one of the leading dramatists of the 20th century. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2005.
You were born in the East End of London and brought up in a time in the East End when it was full of different sorts of violence, political violence, and a lot of struggle going on. Did that play any part in your life?
Oh, yes, it did. I was about 16. I'm Jewish, of course, and I was Jewish then too. So I used to go along to a Jewish boys' club, boys and girls' club, in fact, in Hackney. And fascist groups used to meet and make speeches, very provocative speeches. And there were, numbers of Jews in the area, of course. And we used to leave the boys' club, and it was quite common to suddenly be surrounded by people with broken milk bottles. In fact, I remember they used to smash them as we approached on the walls. And the only way of really dealing with it, in that case, because broken milk bottles were no joke. We were only 16. Seemed to fall out in this kind of manner. One would say, "You're right." And there's something, I think, the native courtesy of the English gentleman. He would be bound to respond by saying, "Yeah, I'm all right. How are you then?" I'd say, "I'm all right. Are you sure you're all right?" "Yeah." I'd say, "Well, that's all right then, isn't it?" And all the time keep walking, you see, to the lights of the main road. And on one occasion we did this, and then made a dash, you see, when we were in the main road, and suddenly realized that one of our number wasn't on the bus with us, you see. He'd gone down another turning, and we'd lost him. And when I got home, I had a very big stick at the time, and I remember feeling quite coldly angry about this, got hold of this very heavy stick and went all the way back, expecting to find him dead. And in fact, he just got across some fields and got home safely. But the anger I do remember very, very clearly to this day, actually.
Coming from a Jewish household where there's traditionally a great respect for scholarship and learning and books, was there in your household that respect and attention paid to that?
Oh, very, very much so, yes. My mother and father cared a great deal about, as you say, learning and civilized behavior, really. And they encouraged me. You see, I became an actor of all things. They were slightly worried by that, but they encouraged it indeed. And they also were even more worried by the fact that I became a conscientious objector when I was about 18. But they stood by me wonderfully there, too.
What set you on acting? Because, as you say, you had access to an understanding of, an appreciation of scholarship, which was another way you could have gone. What made you go for acting?
Well, I saw it as simply the only way I could possibly earn a living, you see.
I first met Harold Pinter when I worked for Monitor with Hugh Weldon. Hugh was going to interview him, and I did the research. And I remember walking down the corridor to the studio. We always recorded on Sundays. In those days at the BBC, Sunday was the day for culture. And Harold in his black suit and his set face. I thought then, but I certainly think now, it was as if he was being led to his execution. He took these things really seriously, and it was a good interview, as I remember. And then I met him later at Hugh's house and saw his plays and saw him around the place. So I went to interview him for the first season of the South Bank shows. At that time, it was quite difficult to get off the ground. And I wanted to do a long interview, a full program on him, and it was difficult.
Did you keep together? You talk about your friends. These are friends from school, from the youth club you used to go to in Hackney. Did you keep together as a group through your 20s? Were they doing similar things, or were they?
No, they weren't doing similar things. I mean, none of them was an actor at that time. Henry Woolf, who was one of them and remains one of them, is now an actor, of course, but he wasn't then.
Henry Woolf, in fact, was the man who not so much commissioned as demanded your first play, didn't he?
Yes, he did.
You'd, as I understand it, you'd promised that you would write a play, or said you would write a play sometime.
Well, what happened was I was actually acting at Colchester at the time, about 56, and a woman in the company invited me to a party in London, you see. And during the course of the party, she said to me, "There's someone I'd like you to meet." He lives upstairs. I think you'll be interested or something to meet him. I said, fine, and off we went, and she knocked at the door, and the door was opened by a little man with the most extraordinarily coloured hair, bare feet, and extremely fluid clothes, that's all I can remember, who was absolutely delightful, charming, never stopped talking, welcomed us in, gave us a cup of tea, discussed philosophy, metaphysics, literature, the weather, crockery, fabrics, you know, never, unceasingly. And all this while, at a table, sat an enormous man with a cap on, reading a comic. And this chap, I mean the little man, was dancing about cutting bread and butter, pouring tea, and making bacon and eggs for this man who remained quite silent throughout the whole encounter. And I asked this woman what this chap's name was, and she said his name is Quentin Crisp. And that was Mr. Crisp. But in fact, this image of the man sitting at the table, silent, and this other fellow dancing about, talking and cutting the bread and butter and so on, remained with me for some weeks. And I told Henry that I might write a play from that image, you see. And he said, fine, when you write it, I'll put it on. So I said, oh, well, okay, but it's going to take me some time, you see. A couple of weeks later, he phoned and said, well, where's the play? I said, but that'd be ridiculous. It's going to take me 6 months to write. He said, well, it can't take you 6 months to write because I have a niche next week, the end of the week, and I could actually do it for 4 performances. So I said, oh, it's out of the question. But in the afternoon at night, I wrote The Room in 4 days, got it to Henry, just came like that, and he put it on. But that play totally without calculation. In other words, I started at the top, and at a certain point, the door was locked on the door, and someone came in. And I honestly had no idea who he was, who he might be, what he might say, and let it run, let it happen, and found that he did have a voice, and that was the landlord, in fact, was the first chap. And then 2 visitors arrived, and I didn't know what they were on about, really, what they wanted, but they were just part of the whole atmosphere.
When you didn't know who the person was who came into the room, did that bother you? Did you seek to discover it, or did you think...
Oh, I sought to discover it, of course. It didn't bother me. I find it, I mean, suddenly if you like to have a blank page, it remains the essential joy of writing, I think. You have a blank page, one moment there's nothing on it, and the next moment there's something on it. Now, if you know what that something's going to be, really fully and comprehensively before you get to it, I don't quite see where the spring of, as you say, of discovery, how it can exist. The discovery exists in the act of discovery.
Harold's fearlessness as a writer begins with the first line. His, you know, if you listen to his Nobel Prize speech, he tells you in the first 20 minutes how to write a play, or how he writes a play. He says he begins with a line. I think he gives an example from the Homecoming where he says, what have you done with the scissors? And he knew only that question when he began the play. Now, the balls that it takes to sit down and write a whole play, not knowing where it's going to go, starting with just one line where you don't know who's asking about the scissors, who they're asking it of, and what's happened to the scissors. He doesn't know any of those things. But he sits down and he writes The Homecoming. I think that need to know characters isn't Harold's concern, because I think that he felt it very much coming through him from a place that he didn't understand. And if you read his very early writings on the subject, he says that he feels, I think, banished from himself is the term he uses when he can't write. And I think that he was sometimes a playwright. And I know the feeling. You know, it's a very odd thing to suddenly be making connections that you can't make on a Tuesday, on a Wednesday, and feel suddenly picked up and possessed by something. You feel like a kite in the wind.
After you saw The Room, your own play, your first play performed, did you think, this is it, this is the life for me, writing plays? And...
Well, I must admit that I became very excited by the way images could clearly be expressed on the stage in theatrical form. It hadn't occurred to me before. And I immediately started to write The Birthday Party.
Harold Pinter's second play, The Birthday Party, is now his most performed play.
Every critic but one panned it. quite cruelly. It was your second play. It must have been very upsetting.
Well, it was my first play professionally done, in fact.
Yes.
The Lyric Hammersmith, and we, it was quite a shock, yes, quite a shock. And I remember going into the Thursday matter, and the usherette said, I was going up to the circle. She said, you can't go in there. I said, why not? She said, there's no one there, we've closed it. So I then said who I was, young at the time. I am the author. She said, oh, are you? She said.
Did you feel so upset that you felt like giving up writing plays?
Yes, I did, that's right. I was very bewildered, quite bewildered. But that feeling lasted only for about 48 hours, as far as I remember. Then I thought, oh, to hell with it. I will go on writing plays.
Was it finally the caretaker that gave you your head of steam?
Yes, Caretaker was very warmly received and ran for a year in London.
When you're watching your plays for the first time and reading them for the first time, there are things which are not, as it were, traditionally clearly explained. And is that something that you employ, live with, or is that just part of the way your characters behave?
I've tried to maintain and preserve an attitude towards my characters, I think, of knowing as much about them as they will allow me to do, and not to impose upon them my own either judgments or arbitrary information. You see, I think we do know very little about each other. We bump into each other, and as I bump into my characters are not my closest friends or my family or whatever. They're strangers to me. I get to know them in a certain way, but they remain finally strangers. And you don't know very much about strangers. One doesn't know very much about other people.
You don't, I find yourself, I think, being drawn to particular characters in Pinter. He's not writing, you know, it's not Shakespeare, he's not writing these types. It's more to do with the tone, the atmosphere, just how that grips. And I think that, you know, I am such a fan. I must have read The Homecoming 50 times and seen it many times. But who the characters are, I'm not sure. You know, it's like characters in songs. I think that his characters are so a part of the overall action that they can't really stand alone. You can't imagine them like you can with an Ayckbourn play, walking in from one Ayckbourn play into another and sitting down and starting a conversation.
What would you say the Homecoming was about?
Oh, what's it about? Well, it's about a family, three brothers, and one brother brings his wife back to the family after an absence of 6 years, and it's about that, about the arrival, the homecoming, if you like, of the elder brother and his wife.
Who then stays on with the family while he goes back to America, presumably.
It's about that, too. It's about how that develops, in other words. It's not about anything else at all. It's just about what takes place, I think.
It was probably one of the most difficult interviews I've done. We got to know each other very well later, and he used to, laugh about it, about how difficult he made it and how difficult he knew he was making it. And I think he even crept towards an apology at one stage after a few drinks late at night. But he was difficult. I wanted to talk about his plays, which I admired enormously, particularly, say, The Homecoming. Well, all Harold would say about that, as I remember, was that somebody comes into a room and meets somebody else. That was about all he would say.
It's a play that has a lot, when I saw it and read it, a play that seems to me to have a lot to do with sex, for example.
It's a relevant factor, yes.
But a relevant factor in the sense that that it arises through the characters and that's it.
Well, I also think sex is a relevant factor.
Because it is rather, it's very dramatic in the way the brother arrives with his wife. The wife is, in the end, willingly taken on by the other brothers and the father to be a prostitute and earn money partly to keep them and partly to keep herself, and he wanders off, which does seem that's a very dramatic turn of events.
Yes.
I'm getting nowhere with this, Harold. I thought I wouldn't get anywhere talking about themes, but still I thought I'd have a go at it.
It's tough, you know, to...
Yeah. Yes.
I was embarrassed that I couldn't get anything moving on this. And then we went into the cutting rooms, and I saw it in the cutting rooms, and I thought, that's really good. That really tells you about Harold Pinter. The fact that he won't answer, except in these, one man comes into a room and meets another man, a man meets his brother. That's what it's about. I've got nothing else to say. That's him. And that's as good as it's going to get. And by me persisting and him resisting, that's really good.
I've written about, I don't know, 16 or so plays, I suppose. And they sit on my shelf, and very occasionally I take one of them down and look at it with some curiosity, as if I'm looking at something which is quite outside myself. There's nothing to do with me whatsoever. And in a certain way, that is what I do feel. That this stuff is what it is, and it's separated, although there is an umbilical cord, but really you can't actually feel it. I'm not disassociating myself from the plays. What I'm saying is that they have an existence of their own, and if I attempt to discuss them and talk about them specifically, I know that I can only talk a lot of guff, and even more guff than anyone else.
Some people have said that what comes out of your work is a strong feeling of despair.
Well, I've said I won't say anything about my writing, as it were, make it a definitive statement, but I'm prepared to make a tentative definitive statement. And that is, you seem to be implying that my work is despairing. I don't feel that to be the case. I feel really that there's a body of feeling in it, which, it is true, certainly escapes some people. But of feeling for others and in the stuff itself. In other words, I don't consider it myself to be bleak, if you like, although there are bleak elements, I'm sure.
Odd life being a writer, isn't it, really? I mean, do you find...
It's not a bad life. Not a bad life.
What are the advantages?
Well, freedom, really. I think one can, to a certain extent, dictate one's own destiny. The ball is in your court, if you see what I mean. I'm not dependent on others, generally speaking, although I'm totally dependent upon others in the course of an actual production, if you see.
What are the disadvantages?
The disadvantages are really when you can't write. You see, I was quite prolific in a way, I suppose, when I was young. And now the gaps are 4 to 5 years between plays.
You've just finished a new play, your first for some years.
Yes, I have.
Must be pleased about that.
Well, I am, yes. It came out of the blue, really, as these things do, and I don't want to say much about it, because we'll see when you'll make up your own mind when it's done, but it is going to be done by Peter Hall at the National in the autumn. But it's a different, it's a very different form to anything I've written before, I think, which interests me very much.
Is it possible to say how very different in form, or in what way?
Well, it's, why don't you find out for yourself?